Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and your patience. So my name is Nora Zaharsky, and I am the press secretary at Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES. We appreciate you taking time during your busy week to go over some expectations for COP29 with us. So first, we're going to begin with some comments from C2ES President Nat Cohen to set the stage for COP from a U.S. policy perspective. Nat is an economist with more than 20 years of energy and environmental policy experience. Before coming to C2ES 3 years ago, he served as Senior Vice President for Climate with the Environmental Defense Fund, where he led their research and policy advocacy on climate change in the United States and globally. From 2011 to 2012, he also served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President for Energy and Environment in the National Economic Council and Domestic Policy Council, helping to shape administration policy on energy and environmental issues. Then, after Nat's remarks, we'll hear from C2ES Vice President for International Strategies, Kaveh Gillenpour, who will lay out some expectations for COP29 from an international angle. And Kaveh joined C2ES from the UN in 2021, where he was a senior advisor on climate change on the UN Secretary General's team. He has more than 20 years of experience working on environmental and climate change issues, including as a lead negotiator on climate change for the European Union and then the Alliance of Small Island States. And then after Kaveh, we'll hear from Nat to wrap things up and have some time for questions. So before I turn things over, just a couple points for housekeeping. The session is being recorded and will be posted on the C2ES YouTube channel, and I'll send around a link as soon as it's available. If you're on this call, hopefully you are on our mailing list, but if you're not, let me know. And you will also get our daily updates during COP. And then, as we all know by now, just a reminder to ask a question, please use the raise hand function on your Zoom control panel, and I will call on everyone, and then please keep your mics muted to avoid background noise. Nat and Kaveh will both be in Baku for COP in 2 weeks, so please keep in touch with us as you're looking for quick reactions and explanations for happenings on the ground. I will drop my contact information in the chat shortly. And with that, Nat, I will hand it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Nora, and thanks to everybody for joining. So as Nora said, I will just give a quick overview to sort of set the stage and then turn it to Kaveh to share a little bit more about the COP expectations. And I'll come back at the end to talk a little bit about some of the non-party issues, the issues we're involved in outside of the negotiations. But just to start with and to provide a little bit of scene setting, on the one hand, the U.S. comes into this COP with a tailwind at its back, given the recent progress, both in legislative terms that we've seen over the past 4 years, especially for the past 3+ years with the bipartisan infrastructure law, and particularly the Inflation Reduction Act, and the kinds of investments and manufacturing and progress that we're starting to see overall. We're also continuing to make progress, although still too slow in emissions and in reducing U.S. emissions. I think last year they were 18% below 2005 emissions, so well short of where they need to be. But the latest projections from the Rhodium Group have us at 34 to 43%, something in that range by the end of the decade. Still much more to be done, but making significant progress relative to where we were 4 years ago. On the domestic front, well, sorry, I should say that. So we have that tailwind and that progress that's been made. But of course, there are enormous uncertainties ahead around the election. I think when we think about the election, and we won't say too much on that here, but it is the context for this whole discussion. On the domestic front, I think the economy has been front and center for most Americans throughout this election, as it is in many elections, but particularly this one. And I think that reality, along with the enormous economic opportunities we're beginning to see become concrete in the clean energy transition, the imperative to win the global clean energy race that I think people on both sides of the aisle are talking about in U.S. politics, and the need to find ways of promoting jobs and investment in the U.S. I think all of those things will continue to support domestic action in some ways, in particular with respect to tax credits. We think that the tax credits that have been put in place under this administration are quite robust on a range of election scenarios, which means that some of that tailwind we think is likely to continue. We also think that there's a great deal of interest domestically on additional areas like how do we reform permitting so that we can build more clean energy infrastructure, and how do we accelerate the clean energy manufacturing and in the industrial sector, perhaps in the context of trade. So we do see some things, regardless of the election outcome, that will allow us to continue to make some progress. But of course, the implications of the election will be stark, not only on US emissions in some ways, but especially in the international context, which is where we're focused today. Many of you may have been at the COP in Marrakesh in 2016. I know that Kaveh and I both were, although wearing different hats than we are today. And so we remember what the impact of that election news was. I think Kaveh, when he begins his remarks in a minute, will say we actually don't think that the COP itself is going to be that affected by the outcome of the election. But clearly what happens over the next 4 years in terms of America's posture in the world, especially with respect to multilateral climate negotiations, the international arena more generally, that obviously is very much at stake. And so the ability to deliver on some of what is decided in the COP will clearly hinge in a very important way on what happens in the elections. And that's in some ways the starkest difference we see among the election scenarios. Finally, let me just say really quickly before I turn it to Kaveh, in terms of C2S presence, Nora mentioned that we'll be on the ground. C2S has been actively involved in the climate negotiations since our founding over 25 years ago. We regularly bring together heads of delegation under Kaveh's leadership. These are the senior negotiators. We bring them together several times a year to build consensus and an understanding where the landing zones may be, so that by the time we go into the COP, Kaveh's team, the international team, has been working with senior negotiators over the entire course of the year, as well as with the COP presidency and others, to really understand and prepare the groundwork for a positive outcome at the COP in terms of the issues in the negotiations. Subiniaz once said that at a COP, there's the COP negotiations, the COP proper, and then there's the greater metropolitan COP, everything that happens outside of those negotiations. And C2S is very much as well a presence there. We don't expect that kind of greater metropolitan COP of the side events and the panels and everything that happens outside of the negotiations themselves. That will likely be much smaller than it was in Dubai last year. I'm sure folks have seen the same estimates. But even if it's significantly smaller, it might be around the size, let's say, of Glasgow was in 2021. And for those of us who were there, we remember that felt a lot at the moment. So even if it's not as big as it's been in years past, we think there still will be a fairly significant presence from a number of companies, NGOs, and others. And I think that reflects the increasing centrality of climate and energy issues to business leadership, to NGOs and civil society, and to policymaking more broadly. So with that kind of scene setter, let me pause and turn it over to Kaveh to discuss the COP and what we expect. Thanks very much. Kaveh, go ahead.
Thanks, Nat. Nora, thank you very much. If you could put the slides up. And next slide, please. So I'm going to talk through a few things to give a bit of context for COP29, set out 5 things that we're going to be watching for, particularly at C2S, and that you might want to look out for. Briefly look at the US election that's just touched upon, but also look beyond COP29 as to why this COP is important and what we can expect afterwards. I'll touch briefly on what C2S might do on the ground at COP29 and how we could be of use to you and the resources we could offer. So next slide, please. So COP29 is going to be very different to COP28. First of all, there are going to be fewer participants. I think COP28 had close to 100,000 people, something in that sort of order of magnitude. That was double the size of the next biggest COP that had happened before that. I think for this one, we can expect to return to that sort of average recent size of around 50,000 participants. And of course, as you may be aware, many organizations have had their allocation of badges for the COP reduced as a result. The other thing is I think we can expect fewer high-level deliverables. COP28 was a little bit unusual in the sense that it had a number of deliverables that were included the global stocktake, which was all-encompassing, covering every aspect of the negotiations from mitigation through to adaptation, finance, and loss and damage. We also had the issue of the capitalization of the loss and damage fund, the agreement of the global goal on adaptation framework. So there was a lot on the plate for that COP. This COP has fewer deliverables, but it's still important. Next slide, please. So 5 things to watch at COP29. The first one is the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. And then there's Article 6 on carbon markets. Those are on bold in this presentation because they are the 2 main anticipated deliverables for this COP. The third issue that we'll be looking for is follow-up on the global stocktake from COP28. Also, some momentum around nationally determined contributions, the climate targets that countries have to come forward with, and then finally, the biannual transparency report. So I'll come to each of these in turn. Next slide, please. So the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, what is it? You probably are fully aware by now, but it's essentially in 2009 at COP15, developed countries agreed to provide or mobilize $100 billion in climate finance by 2020 for developing countries. Now that was arguably reached in 2022, but that target comes to an end in 2025. So these negotiations, which have been ongoing all of this year and sometime before that, are about trying to agree what will succeed that. So there's some key issues to watch out for here. One is the quantum, what will be the new 100 billion. The other is who will be the donors that provide this 100 billion? Is it still going to be that relatively narrow group of countries that have been providing climate finance under the Paris Agreement to date, or is that going to be broadened to include some of the richer emerging economies? There's also the issue of the structure of the goal. Is it going to be just a simple quantum as we've seen in the past, or is it going to be a little bit multi-layered? So there's talk about having an outer layer of investment for climate action in the order of $1 trillion per annum. There's also the issue of whether there'll be specific sub-targets for things like adaptation and loss and damage. So that's really the main deliverable for this COP, and to a large extent will determine whether or not this COP is a success. Next slide, please. Also is the question of Article 6 on carbon markets. Most of the implementing guidance for international carbon markets were agreed at the COP in Katowice and also in Glasgow. There are still a few highly technical issues remaining that need to be sorted out before the carbon markets are fully operational. The real challenge is how do we get political guidance during the COP to move forward on these technical items? And there's this disconnection potentially between the highly technical aspects of this topic and what ministers can do to resolve it. But there is a lot of political pressure for this to be sorted out at this COP, and I feel pretty confident that these issues will be closed finally at COP29. So I think there's going to be a good outcome on Article 6. Next slide, please. So outside of the formal negotiations, we'll be looking in particular at COTS for follow-up and progress on the global stocktake. We undertook a 3-year project at COTS trying to shape the outcome of COP28 on the global stocktake. And one of the things we were pushing for was a clarity on what would happen after COP28 ended. So we achieved globally the adoption of a number of collective signals and targets at COP28, such as the tripling of renewable energy, doubling of energy efficiency, early warning systems for all by 2027. And it's going to be essential to follow up on these. And it's really good to see that the COP29 presidency is talking about this as one of the priorities for the COP. It'll be interesting to see how that shapes up in reality on the ground. The reason why follow-up is important, well, firstly, these targets that were agreed at COP28 in the various sectors are essentially what needs to be done if the world is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and climate resilience. But also the mandate of the global Stocktake is to inform the new climate targets and to enhance international cooperation. And we believe very strongly that to move to transformative levels of climate action, you need to have this enhanced international cooperation. And we've just released a suite of papers that describes what that might look like. So I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. The other area to follow closely is the COP29 presidency has said that they want to deliver ambition and momentum towards new climate targets. These nationally determined contributions are due on the 10th of February 2025, and they're required to be more ambitious than the previous ones. There's an expectation that more countries will move to having economy-wide NDCs that cover all greenhouse gases. But importantly, these new NDCs should also be informed by and respond to the global stocktake. So in addition to looking for the headline targets in these new NDCs, we'll be looking to see whether they say something specifically about how each country will contribute to achieving the goals and targets that were set out in the global stocktake, such as the tripling of renewable energy. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is an issue that attracts the least attention, but is vitally important, and that's the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. This is a key component of the ambition cycle under the Paris Agreement and the theory of change behind the Paris Agreement, which is essentially every 5 years, countries come together to see how they're doing against the goals of the Paris Agreement, inform new targets and set those new targets, but then each country is required to report on how they're doing against those targets. So for the first time under the Paris Agreement, this requirement applies to all countries, and these biannual transparency reports are due by the end of this year. So it'll be very interesting to see whether we see a big group of countries coming forward by and during the COP with these enhanced these biannual transparency reports. The COP29 presidency is having a big push around this topic. So this is something also important to watch. Next slide, please. So Nat's touched on the US election. We've been here before. We had a US election, presidential election in the middle of COP22 in 2016. There's some differences though this time. This time we'll have the election before the COP starts. So depending on how things go, we may know what the result is, although that result may only come during the COP or maybe even after the COP. So that's still to be seen. But the main difference is I think we have a clearer idea of what to expect in this scenario of whether whichever candidate wins the presidential election. So we're not really going into this unclear as to what the impact would be. I think we have a fairly clear idea with each candidate. But the most important thing is that if COP29 delivers on its two main mandates of the NCQG, the finance target, and also Article 6, the key negotiations under the Paris Agreement will have been completed at COP29, which takes us potentially into a very different scenario that we'll be operating in. So next slide, please. And this is what I wanted to touch on here. If COP29 delivers, essentially we're going to be entering into what could be coined a post-negotiating phase under the UNFCCC process, because all of the rules under the Paris Agreement will have been agreed. The Paris Agreement will be fully operational, and essentially we'll be into this 5-year cycle of global stock takes and then the transparency reports to see how we're doing against promised targets. So COP30 potentially, if COP29 delivers on what it should deliver, COP30 could be a very key moment and opportunity to rethink and reset what the international climate process is about, given particularly, as we've seen from the UNEP-GAP report, that the rhetoric of what countries say they're doing is not really being seen in the implementation and the emissions reductions that are necessary. Next slide, please. On the ground, CTS will be deeply involved in the negotiations of all the key issues I've been talking about. We'll be hosting a number of public events, including on how to take forward the targets and signals from the global stocktake. we've released and will be releasing a number of technical papers that will be useful to you and to negotiators to try to take forward key aspects of the negotiations. As in past years, we'll be providing daily updates of key deliverables and events from the COP. And we'll have resources that we can share with you, which Nora will share with you in due course, including a dedicated COP29 webpage. And with that, I hand back to you, Nora.
And I'll just step in really briefly before we go to questions with a few reflections on one of the other efforts that we're involved in, which essentially complements and tries to extend in many ways all the efforts that are being done in the negotiations. I think the broader context here, we know that we need, just as in any individual country context, we need a whole of government approach to addressing climate change. In the international context, the negotiations are a driving factor, but we also, I think in recent years, there's been a lot of effort to create the kind of public-private partnerships that can drive change and mobilize finance and solutions outside the formal negotiations. One of these is the Energy Transition Accelerator that we've been involved with nearly since the inception. This was launched by John Kerry at COP27 at Sharm el Sheikh. Although at the time, I think it was just a kind of an idea, a glimmer in Secretary Kerry's mind. It's a partnership of the US State Department, the Bezos Earth Fund, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And C2S came on early in 2023, last year, to help provide some structure to it, to help drive it along and flesh out some of the ideas. We became the Secretariat this year. And we will be holding some events and supporting the partners at COP29 and going forward. The ETA, as we've called it, is the mission, or the goal of it is to accelerate a just clean energy transition in developing countries and emerging economies. We know that we have no hope of keeping the door alive to 1.5 degrees or even being well below 2 degrees if we don't accelerate the shift away from unabated fossil fuels, coal in particular in the power sector, if we don't accelerate the shift towards zero carbon power, renewables, and other forms. And doing all of that means also investing in communities, means investing in power grids and transmission lines. And so there's an enormous effort underway that needs to be underway to drive the decarbonization and the accelerated clean energy transition in developing countries. The IEA estimates we need $1.6 trillion in emerging markets and developing countries outside China over the coming years. We think that the ETA can help contribute that in a minor way. It's not going to be able to provide the whole of that gap or even a major portion, but we need everything we can to fill it. And what the ETA is doing is enabling developing countries and emerging economies to generate revenue from carbon credits, from high quality carbon credits that are produced by, or that will be produced by, reductions in emissions from across the entire power sector of a country. So we're developing and encouraging methodologies that could measure those emissions reductions. We're creating a coalition of companies that are interested in buying those carbon credits and countries that want to invest and have that finance flow into their countries in order to rapidly reduce their emissions from the power sector. We're working closely with the World Bank on analytical and modeling products, and we're beginning to have conversations with the financial sector about how to finance this up front on the basis of that carbon credit revenue. This is an effort that's, as I said, has been underway now for a couple of years. We had a roundtable event at the New York Climate Week. We brought together the countries and the companies involved, and we'll plan to have an event at the U.S. Center at COP29 to give a further update. We expect this to be coming really to fruition over the next year. So I mention that because that's also something not only that C2S is involved in, but it's also, I think, emblematic of the many efforts outside of the formal negotiations to find ways of accelerating solutions, accelerating finance into the emissions reductions we need and that we urgently need to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement.